So there was a little bit of good news this week when some parts of the PCSC Bill, which I was talking about last week, were voted down in the House of Lords. And the irony of an unelected House of Lords being the ones who step up to protect our freedom to protest in a democracy is horrendous, and it highlights how much is wrong with our governmental system and the way that things work in the UK. Which is also highlighted by the fact that while this was going on, the elections bill went through the Commons, and that's now headed over to the Lords. And this is the bill that brings in voter ID across the UK. So going forwards, you will need either your passport or your driving licence or a form of approved photographic ID to vote. And I mean, the obvious problem with that is that which groups of people in our society have a passport and or a driving licence? And the answer is the wealthiest, the people with the most freedom, the people who are the most privileged in our society, the ones who can afford to drive, can afford to learn to drive, the ones that can afford to travel. These things cost money. The government is saying, don't worry, we'll introduce a scheme where local councils can provide a free photographic ID card to people who haven't got one. But that's just putting still another obstacle in the place of all those people who didn't already have one. Like, it doesn't make life that much more difficult if you've already got those things, but it's a hurdle. If you haven't, you have to take the time off work to fill in forms, to go down to the council office to figure out what it is that you're supposed to do, how it works. It's likely to cost about 18 million a year, which is just, money that we could have spent on something useful. They actually did a trial of this in a few small areas, and guess what happens? Overall, about 1,000 people who showed up to vote and were told, sorry, we need photographic ID, went away and didn't come back. So about 1,000 people then didn't vote when they should have done. And they didn't even try it in areas where there are high numbers of people who are likely to have been affected by the not having a driving licence, not having a passport kind of thing. We know that these laws, because we've seen them enforced and brought in around the world, especially in the US, disproportionately affect people of colour and working class people. Quelle surprise that the Conservatives don't want those people voting. There's loads of other issues with it. If, for example, having to check people's photographic ID and make sure it matches up to them, it gives like a load of extra power to the people sat in your local voting booth. What are they going to do if you don't look like... It's one thing if you're told, no, you can't have any lager in Tesco's because that doesn't really look like you. We think you might have borrowed your dad's ID. But it's kind of different, isn't it? If it's like, no, I don't think you look like this, you're not allowed to participate in democracy. And at very least, it's going to take time to check people against their photographic ID, which means that queues will be longer and slower moving. And if, let's say, for example, completely random selection, you're somebody with quite a serious circulatory disorder, like me, the longer you have to wait outside in the cold, there comes a point where, like, that's not a good idea for my health. The real issue at the heart of it, though, is that it solves an imaginary problem. Right, they've basically made this up, and this is what they've been saying. They've been saying in-person voter fraud doubled between 2014 and 2016. Well, it did. It went from 21 allegations to 44 allegations, and that's out of something like 50 million voters. So you can see that it's an absolutely tiny number, and let's be honest, it represents people overwhelmingly who didn't realise that they weren't allowed to tell their mate to go and vote for them. People showing up going, oh yeah, oh no, I'm not Brian, I'm here to vote for Brian, and somebody's going, mate, that's actually not how it works, you're not allowed to do that. Does it surprise us that there are 44 people that stupid out of the millions of voters around the UK? No, not in the slightest. And anyway, it went up from 21 to 44, and then in 2017, the next year, it fell back down to 28. So it's an imaginary problem. In order to actually change the result of a vote by fraudulently voting on behalf of other people, you would need to, it would have to be hundreds of votes to stand any chance of actually affecting the outcome. So you'd have to find hundreds of people who you were absolutely confident weren't going to go and vote. And then you'd have to find out which election stations they were going to go to, and then you'd have to get a group of people to go in and out of those election stations all day, presumably changing costumes, because if anybody recognised you from having been in to vote earlier, you might get away with saying that's my twin once, and then after that basically it becomes completely ridiculous. And if any of those people you've gone in having taken their name to go and vote in their name actually goes in to vote before or after you, then the deception is immediately uncovered and legal proceedings will immediately begin. So it's like the idea that any election outcome could be changed by people doing this is mythological. There's absolutely no evidence for it. If we want to bring in checking IDs, I strongly suggest we do it for people who go to Downing Street parties. And then we can just keep a list of everyone who goes to a Downing Street party. And when it turns out, surprisingly enough, that it's completely illegal, we could do something about it. But what is really interesting is that this solves an imaginary problem in an expensive way and disenfranchises loads of people. It claims to prevent elector fraud. It actually, in my opinion, is a piece of election fraud. There's a huge issue in the UK. There are about 9 million people in the UK who are eligible to vote but are not correctly registered to do so, either because they're not registered at all or because they're registered in like an old address or whatever, out of date information, and so they're not actually going to be able to vote. And there's a whole bunch of things that we could be doing to resolve that problem. The first is we should have a voter registration drive. And there's really straightforward ways of doing this. So first of all, when kids reach 16 or 17, they can add themselves to the electoral register. They won't be able to vote in most cases until they're 18, depending on what the smaller elections sometimes allow younger people to vote. But they can put themselves on the electoral register at that age. So schools should just be saying, right, okay, you're all turning 16 this year. Here's how you do it. Here's the forms. Fill them in. Get yourself on the electoral register. Then we know that young people often slide off it when they move to go to university or college. And there have actually been trials where students at a university, when they arrived, were given the forms to move their voter registration to their university address. It was like provided with their freshers kit pack, along with an invitation to the, all-you-can-drink pyjama party down the Union, or whatever it is that young people do these days. I genuinely have no idea. We could also be doing that when people move house, because that's another key time when people's ID becomes invalid because their address is no longer accurate. So we should be talking to moving companies and real estate agents and landlords and property people who organise rental properties and things like that, and making sure that they have stacks and stacks of voter registration forms, and whenever anybody new moves in, they're like, by the way, here's the form. That would get lots more people onto the electoral register. Oh, and one more. This is amazing, isn't it? People who move to this country and gain citizenship are expected to pay hundreds and hundreds of pounds to get their citizenship, to get their big citizenship ceremony, to take the test to prove that they understand about life in the UK. And they stand in front of a picture of the Queen and they swear allegiance, and nobody gives them a voter registration form. It should be the first thing that we do. Right, you're a British citizen now. Here you go. Fill this in. Participate in our democracy. Isn't that what we're so freaking proud of in this country? It should be automatic and standard. Secondly, we should be encouraging postal votes, because it's actually much harder to commit fraud with a postal vote because it's sent to your address. So only those who have access to your address even potentially could. So even if what's the maximum number of people you could possibly live with? 8 people in your house. It makes it really, really difficult for people to commit fraud because they don't have access to those pieces of paper. It also is easier to vote postally. There's less risk of catching COVID. I don't know if you've heard, there's a global pandemic on. It's easier for people with mobility issues. It's easier for people who live busy and complicated lives, have caring responsibilities. It's easier for people who travel often for work or for pleasure. It's easier for people who have mobility issues and have difficulty getting out of the house. It also means that whilst you're voting, you can take the time to look up information about those candidates, rather than that thing where you get to the voting booth and you're like, okay, that's what I wanted to vote in the general election. What's this? Police, crime, and who are these guys? Okay, hang on, I don't know anything about these people. It means you could actually go, hold on, let me go and find out who they are, see what they've said about themselves, see what they stand for, and it would encourage people to vote more in the smaller elections that often go on simultaneously, where you like local councillors. Who's this independent candidate? What are they pushing for? What do they want? We could actually look that stuff up better, more effectively, if we vote from home. It makes it much easier for people to vote if they do it postally, and we should be encouraging that. Next up, we should replace first past the post, because it is basically the worst electoral system that anybody has come up with. It is only slightly better than, oh, give up, let's just have a dictator. it is the only electoral system in the world that basically says if you really hate what a politician stands for and you think they're the wrong person for the job, the very, very worst thing you can do is stand against them. Because if you stand against them, all you do is you dilute the vote for everybody else who opposes them in any way, however different their opinions may be to yours. It is the worst system that anybody has ever come up with. And I shudder to remember that time when we were offered to switch it to AV, to alternate voting, and so many people I know, smart, lovely people, said, oh well, proportional representation would be better, so I'll hold out for that. Well, it didn't happen, did it? We're still stuck with the worst possible thing. AV would be better, PR would be even better. Research these things, get involved with campaigns to bring these things in, because without them we don't stand a chance of having a fair and reasonable democracy. And without that, why should people vote? I understand why people don't bother to register. And on that note, what we should also do is have politicians worth voting for. I know it's radical, but the fact is that when people look at what is going on right now, there are 600 elected politicians who are waiting for a report into whether or not loads of people showing up at Downing Street with their partners and suitcases full of booze constituted a party. Like, it literally is not that hard. We need real, honest people. We've also got Conservative politicians who are saying they might release the information about how they were blackmailed into supporting Boris Johnson. I need politicians who, if they are being blackmailed or if they believe there is blackmail going on in our political system, which is clear evidence of corruption, will immediately release that information and immediately make sure that the people participating in that are held to account and chased out of office, because come on. And finally, we need a proper quality press that reports honestly and earnestly on what is going on, and that's a little bit prescient at the moment, because it turns out that, you know, we've only just found out about all the lockdown parties, but do you know that there was one in April 2020 and the deputy editor of The Sun went to the party? And yet we only just found out about it now. We should have a government that are scared of the press, that are worried that whatever they're going to do is going to be subject to intense scrutiny and that they're going to be dragged over the coals if they step out of line and do stuff that doesn't really help people. And instead of which, the press are not only covering things up, but they're literally there at the party, which itself is getting covered up. It's an absolute disgrace and an outrage. And to be honest, I don't even think that the election bill is a fitting subject for there to be a bill about. I think that we need to have an independent body that runs our elections, because asking the government themselves to decide how elections are run means that we constantly have this backwards and forwards, because the next person to take power tries to change the system to benefit them. It goes backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. It is basically like asking turkeys what we should put on a frickin' Christmas menu. They are never going to vote for a fair and just system, because if they had one, we'd get rid of them. Perhaps it's time we called on the United Nations to send in independent observers and run the system for us, because that's what we do when places around the world aren't getting a fair and reasonable crack at democracy. And right now, nor are we. See you next week.